Hello, everyone. We are sorry for the delay. We've been having a few technical difficulties, but we're ready to start now as we have a lot of our participants online. We are very happy today to have to conduct our second series, our second webinar on our PBO series, and talk about gender budgeting and impact analysis. We are very lucky to have three very distinguished speakers. Armin Yalnizyan from an economist from Canada who's done a lot of work on gender budgeting and will give us a broad and overview on the subject itself. And then we will continue with Helmut Berger, who is the head of the Austrian Parliamentary Budget Office, and with its deputy Christina Fuchs, who will share the Austrian PBO's experience in doing gender budgeting and impact analysis. I know we're late, so we're going to start right away with Armin. So Armin, over to you. Well, I think we're having a few difficulties with connecting with Armin. So I think we should probably continue with start with Christina and her presentation. Christina, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. We will try to share the screen now.
We can see you.
So we would kindly ask Armin to stop sharing her screen. All right. Great. So if you can start sharing your screen, Christina.
Okay.
All right, we see the presentation, so please take it away.
Thank you, Amal. Good afternoon or good morning from Vienna, Austria. We will report on the Austrian experiences with gender budgeting and impact assessment from the perspective of the Austrian Parliamentary Budget Office. And I would like to start introducing you very quickly to the office itself, and then I will continue with some facts about gender equality in Austria, and would like to briefly introduce you to two tools that we use in Austria to account for gender aspects. So the first tool is the performance budgeting framework, and the second one is the regulatory impact assessment and the way how we account for gender aspects in the impact assessments. And then I would like to hand over to Helmut, and he will comment on the gender equality and gender budgeting debate in our parliament. So let me start to introduce you to our office. The Parliamentary Budget Office has been established in 2012 in course of a substantial budget law reform in Austria. And we provide government independent expertise and support the parliamentarians, the MPs, in budget approval and in budget control. Our main tasks, you can see them here on the slide. I will not go into much detail. I will just highlight that we do analysis on all substantial documents from the Ministry of Finance on budgetary matters. We prepare analysis upon requests of the MPs of our budget committee. And we do also analysis regarding the impact assessment and provide support for other parliamentarian committees. And finally, we also consult parliamentarians on performance and gender budgeting issues. Currently, our team consists of 8 people, 8 headcounts, so we are 6 academic experts and to people who help us and are assistants. And we as a Parliamentary Budget Office are part of the parliamentarian administration, but we have independent access to our MPs and to the Budget Committee. So the establishment of the Parliamentary Budget Office was very closely linked to a fundamental budget law reform. And this law reform changed in very important elements of the Austrian budget law system. So we introduced a medium-term expenditure framework and a system of accrual accounting and budgeting. And we also introduced a performance budgeting system. So this performance budgeting system is based on a new constitutional principle that we call outcome orientation. And this principle foresees that we integrate, especially also gender aspects, into our budget management system. We also have added a commitment to effective gender equality into the Austrian constitution. So not only there's a legal provision in our new federal budget law, but also in the Austrian constitution. So since 2013, the new budget law requires the executive to apply performance budgeting and results-oriented management of administrative units. And since 2013, we also have a new regime of impact assessments, and that foresees impact assessment, ex-ante impact assessments, and then ex-post evaluation of new regulations and projects with budgetary consequences. So in 2013, Austria introduced gender budgeting as a part of a very broad package of reforms. What I would like to do now is I would like to show you a few facts on gender equality in Austria. This is a perspective, a European perspective. So the slide should show you that the gender pay gap in Austria in comparison to other EU member states is quite high. You see that the number in 2015 is about 21.7%. And so the gender pay gap is one of the largest in the European Union and well above the European Union average of 16.3%. There is considerable decline if you look at the development during the last couple of years. So we see some progress if we compare the numbers to 2006, but still, as I mentioned, the gender pay gap in comparison to the EU 27 is still rather high in Austria. I would like to show you also a number of reasons for that gender pay gap in Austria. You see here the female employment rate in the European Union, and especially also the numbers for Austria. And the female employment rate in comparison to other European Union countries is rather high in Austria, so it's 67.1%. But if you look now at the part-time employment rate, you see that we also have a high number of part-time employees. So most of the part-timers in Austria are female, and that shows you the two developments. So in recent years, the woman employment rate has increased more than that of men in Austria. The women in the age of between 20 and 50 have a distinctively lower rate than women without children. And in Austria, in most two-parent families, particularly the ones with smaller children, the mothers are the ones that are concentrated in part-time jobs. So if we look at the part-time rate again in Austria and in the European Union, for Austria, the numbers say that nearly 50% of the women in Austria are actually working part-time. For the men, the numbers are much, much smaller. It's just about 10% of men. So here I would just like to highlight the numbers, a couple of numbers for the Austrian Parliament. The Austrian Parliament is a two-chamber parliament, so we have the National Council and the Federal Council. And here you see we have about 183 members of parliament in the National Council, and right at this time the women part is about 31.1%, so 57 women are represented in the National Council right now. And for the Federal Council, the numbers are approximately the same, so it's the number of women is 20 right now. So you see that we have a very good reason to integrate a clearer gender perspective within the Austrian budget management. We have a clear ways for action to improve the situation, particularly in comparison to the European Union countries. And what I would like to do now is I would just like to very briefly introduce you to two tools that we use in Austria at the federal level, and to apply a broader gender perspective into our policies. And the first one is our performance budgeting framework, and then the second one would be the impact assessments. So here I would like to start with the performance budgeting framework. So we apply a gender perspective in our performance budgeting framework, and you see here the way how we try to do that. So gender equality is an integral part of the framework itself, and under each of our 33 budget chapters, the ministers have to define what we call outcome-oriented objectives, and they have to define up to maximum 5 outcome-oriented objectives, and one of those objectives has to be a gender objective. So the budget itself should show outcomes and outputs to be achieved with the underlying budgets. And in Austria, since this budget law reform of 2013, the parliament also decides on the outcomes and outputs as part of the annual budget bill. So the performance information is an integrated part of the budget at all budget levels. It's no longer just the numbers, but also the performance information. And here, this slide should show you the way how we try to integrate a gender perspective in the performance setting of our budget. So within the budget cycle, as I just mentioned, there is the requirement for the executive to integrate the gender aspects in the budget process, in the budget bill itself. And progress on the achievement of the performance objective has to be reported. It has to be reported in an annual federal performance report, and that report has to be submitted to Parliament by October 31st of each year. So if we look at all the objectives that have been defined by the ministries, we see that most ministries have defined targets with an impact on the society. and only a few of them also use internal organizational targets. And in consequence, or relying to what I said about the statistics, we also see that the most relevant Austrian gender equality issues have been addressed by the ministries. So, for example, that deals with major income imbalances between women and men. It deals with unequal rates of part and full-time employment. So, as I said, there are significantly more women in part-time work than men. It also deals with high numbers of women receiving financial state support. And another example is also the unequal rates between women and men engaged in unpaid work. So the legal requirements of the federal law reform have been mostly fulfilled. And the next slide should show you some examples of gender objectives that have been used by the executive. So, for example, let's look at the very first one, to reduce the gender pay gap. And that is one of the objectives of the Ministry of Finance, of the tax department there. And the way how they formulated that is that they want to improve distribution of paid and unpaid work between women and men by the tax system, so by tax measures. Or another example of a gender objective is the representation of women in the institution's in the board of directors, or to improve the balance between family and career, or there's another objective on poverty. So the idea is that in the Austrian performance budgeting framework, the ministries are required to apply a gender perspective in performance setting and to define measures and indicators and outputs that they want to achieve. The objective itself is the choice of the minister, and the minister or the minister of the policy field, of the policy area, sets the priority. And Helmut might comment on that later, but in the first couple of years, we saw that there is a lack of coordination between the ministries on the way how they coordinated their objectives. But that will be part of our of the analysis of the challenges a little later. So this should show you the very first tool that we use in Austria since 2013. And the second tool is the way how we assess for gender aspects in the course of our regulatory impact assessments. So again, since 2013, the public administration has to provide impact assessments for every new draft law and regulations or major projects. And it's a new regime that has been substantially enlarged. It comprises the definition of objectives and outputs and indicators according to the new principle of outcome orientation. And it also entails a two-step procedure to identify and assess substantial impacts in various policy areas. So we call them impact dimensions. That could be impacts on the public budgets, impacts on the economy, impacts on environmental impacts, or as well as the gender impacts that I will allude to a little bit later again. So the ministry staff itself is provided with an IT tool to carry out the assessments and to present the results. And the impact assessment has to be part of the consultation materials. That's the ex ante part of the assessment, and then there also has to be an ex post internal evaluation of the assessment, and that has to be reported to Parliament in the course of a report on all the internal evaluations of a certain year. And I will show you now the way how the gender aspects are included into this tool. So the way how it's done is that the ministry staff is first required to identify possible effects of a new government bill and then assess the substantiality. And that, so the first part of the assessment is that the ministry staff has to evaluate whether a government bill causes effects on the equality of women and men by suggesting changes to, for example, payments to natural or legal persons, to ask the question who benefits of subsidies, for example, of the government. Another question would be that whether a government bill causes effects to the employment, to income or education. And then you see here the other aspects that are part of the assessment. So aspects such as unpaid work or public revenue, or also decision-making processes and decision-making bodies are covered by the assessment. Another aspect is health. So we ask whether a government bill has impacts or effects on the prevention of diseases, on prevention of illnesses, whether there are consequences for the distribution of medical products or changes to life habits. So if the ministry staff identifies impacts, then in the next step of the two-step procedure, there's the question whether these impacts are substantial. And for this question, we have the executive has defined thresholds, and all these thresholds are also integrated into the IT tool. So for the ministry staff, it should be there should be a facilitation to be able to answer these questions. And if we look at the implementation of the new impact assessment regime, we'll see that the regime itself and the changes to it are still rather young, and there's a very broad variety in the quality of the assessment. So only in 2015, the government has decided that there should also be a possibility of simplified impact assessment, and has raised the expectation that this should help to boost the quality of the remaining full assessments. So far, we see that still there's room for improvement. In general, one could also comment that the impact assessment and the performance budgeting system, they require the ministry staff to formulate meaningful objectives and indicators and measure these outputs and impacts, and there is still quite a lack of experience among ministry staff. But we have also a new federal performance management office, and that office it tries to provide support and quality assurance. From the perspective of the PBO and from our perspective here in Parliament, we have to report that traditionally the focus of impact assessments was very strongly on financial impacts on the public budgets. And also we here in the Parliamentary Budget Office, we do most of our analysis on the financial impacts on public budgets and on those government bills that are debated in the Budget and in the Finance Committee. So we also see that the quality of some of the assessments in the other impact dimensions is very often not very high, and we also see that sometimes the ownership for some of those impact dimensions and the assessments of other ministries is not very high. So far, one first lesson from the implementation of the new system of impact assessments could be that there is still rather a very small impact on the policy design of measures with a gender equality focus. And there's also rather limited interest for the evaluation reports. Let me now hand over to Helmut. I hope we will just turn the screen a little bit, and he will comment on some of the developments in the Austrian Parliament.
Yes, hello, good afternoon also from my side. Christina provided an overview on the new instruments that were implemented with the budget law reform, and especially their connection to gender issues and gender budgeting. And I will now give an overview how these instruments, these new instruments, affect the debate in the budget committee and in the National Council, or in the debates in the plenary on gender issues and on gender equality. I have to mention that we basically have two committees that are dealing with gender issues. One is the General Committee on Gender Equality, and the other committee is the Budget Committee. I will concentrate on the Budget Committee, but there is a possibility in Austria to substitute or replace members of the Budget Committee by other MPs, and so the persons that are dealing with the gender issues in the Gender Equality Committee and in the Budget Committee are often the same. So the question is, did these new instruments really change the debate in the parliament? Because we also, in the past, we had debates on gender issues, but now we have new instruments. And so what we saw was that, especially in the first 2 or 3 years of these new instruments, the outcome orientation provided new and additional information for a sound discussion of the gender dimension and gender impacts of the budget. So the MPs had new data, new figures, new objective or formulated objectives that they hadn't in the past. And so we can notice that there was really a high importance of gender equality and gender budgeting in the whole budget debate. And this topic was on the agenda of practically all the political parties, with very different views sometimes. Some of the parties even saying that we have over-gendered our budget, so to say. But nevertheless, we saw that there is really a big contribution of all different parties to that topic. What we also noticed was that this topic, especially in the beginning, still was very, very female. That means that most of the speakers were female members of the parliament. And also we see that there was no clear distinction between gender equality objectives and female promotion, because gender does not only relate to women, but also to men. But we saw that there was some misunderstanding in the beginning. And so it was no wonder that most of the questions were concerning the equal treatment of women, and only in single cases the equal treatment of men. Also, we have some objectives that also relate to the equal treatment of men. For example, some objectives concerning the health care that is quite different for men and women. So we saw a high interest of all the members of parliament, but we saw also criticism and challenges for improvement. Not so much the objectives were questions, but more the measures or the indicators or the ambitions of the ambition of some of the objectives. Question was the relevance of the objectives, and members often ask for more clearer definitions, so that it's really traceable what are the outcomes of these objectives and what are the success of the policy that you can see. Then we saw that there was no really target orientation of defined measures and activities. As Christina already said, we have sometimes only internal goals or internal objectives, but not performance objectives. So there was the question whether they are really fulfilling all these criteria that are in the new budget law. Then we sometimes find a lack of ambition regarding the performance indicators. That was not only typically for the gender objectives, but when the performance system was introduced, there were different approaches from the ministries. Some of the ministries had very ambitious objectives. Other ones were very much interested that they could finally report on successes and that they fulfill their objectives, and they want to bring the minister in a position where he has to defend a missing success, so to say. And here we had to see some lack of ambition in the goals. What we also saw that there are often no clear connections to available funds, or there were no linkage to available funds. So sometimes we had the questions whether our system is really a performance budgeting system, or it's more or a gender budgeting system, or it's more a gender-informed system. What was already mentioned was that the general overview on targets in the federal budget report was missing. So that this means that every ministry defined in their respective budget chapters gender objectives, but these gender objectives were not really combined to global chapters or to specific problems. So we see a lack of coordination between the ministries. Sometimes we saw that they used the same objective, but they used different indicators, or they had different objective values for their indicator. So this was in the beginning a problem, and finally the Federal Performance Management Office was entrusted with the new charge to coordinate the different ministries, especially on gender issues. The main challenges that we saw in the budget debate was the level of objectives, activities, and indicators differ sometimes in respect also of quality, but also in ambition. And we also, on the other hand, say very ambitious general objectives that were set by ministries, but they couldn't be fulfilled just by one ministry. For example, the Ministry of Finance, as Christina already said, has as one objective the reduction of the gender pay gap. But by the taxation system, they can contribute only a little bit to these objectives, but this must be a general objective of the whole government, or at least some ministries. And so this was also one of the recommendations of the Austrian parliamentary budget office, that ministries should consider to pick common goals, and everyone has a part in fulfilling this goal and can contribute with his measures in his field of responsibility. Yeah, the other issues I think I have already covered. So when we make a final summary of the implementation of gender budgeting in Austria, and what can we say after nearly 5 years of implementing this system? We saw that gender equality and gender budgeting are now more or less an integrated part of the performance budgeting system. And so, in general, the legal requirements of the federal budget law have mostly been fulfilled. Gender budgeting now is considered on all budget management levels, and when you talk to ministries and with the budget people in the ministries, you see that they are very well aware of all their gender objectives, and that they have to incorporate in their budget documents gender objectives. And it's no longer like it was in the past, a topic that is attributed to one single entity of a ministry, but it more or less becomes a part of the whole management of the ministry. And so, acknowledging that, we saw that the new federal budget law really was a lever for gender equality. We have a higher awareness on gender budgeting and gender equality, and we have an intense discussion of the objectives in the budget committee and in the plenary session. This does not mean that you can see immediately better results, because as Christina already indicated with the slides that she showed, we are not among the front runners of gender equality. This may be the reason why we have such an elaborated legal framework, because we know that we have some deficits, and we know that there is a lot to do. And we also saw that also when using these new instruments, there is a lot of improvement regarding the implementation of the system. For example, the already mentioned coordination between the ministries, but we also are lacking gender disaggregated data. And we saw that projects for collecting gender disaggregated data are not so much on the agenda of the ministries. This might be a reason, because this can be quite costly, and now we have a phase of budget consolidation, and so this was not among the priorities. And we are also missing the stronger connects to the budget to really speak from gender budgeting. Now we have more or less a system where we include gender equality in our budget process, but we not really have a really gender budgeting system. You know, there is a lot of discussion how to define gender budgeting. In the view of the budget office, as we are the budget office, there should be always a clear link to budget figures and to gender disaggregated expenditure, or to the analyzing of expenditure in respect of the impact on the gender dimension. But in total, you can say that this new system has improved the situation. It has improved the information of the public, the information of the parliament. And so we hope that we'll see also some improvement in the figures quite soon. And when we compare it to the situation 5 years before, we can see that we are in some of the indicators a little bit better than we were 5 years ago. So you can say this new system, pays to introduce, and it also has some really positive effects on the gender situation in Austria.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, this was great. Thank you for the very comprehensive conversation. Now we have Armin on the line. So if you can, please stop sharing your screen, because Armin has a few slides as well, and we will go a bit beyond time. We have the presentation. We have the room till 10:30, so we will continue with Armin's presentation, and then let's see if we have some time to take a few more questions at the end as well. But Armin, I see you are online. Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you very well.
And you can see the slides?
We don't see the slides yet, but we see you.
All right. We were going to see why we don't see the slides in a second. I'm so sorry about this. There has been a difficulty.
Yeah. All right. So now, yes, we see it. So.
All right.
Please
so
go
should
on.
I begin?
Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. And as you will see, there is a certain amount of repetition, but repetition is the heart of pedagogy. So undoubtedly, you will leave knowing certain facts very well. Why is it so difficult to do gender budgeting when we know that greater equality pays off? Well, I guess my argument to you will be that in this new world that we are all operating in, we are looking at slow and slowing growth. And this is a chart that shows IMF's real GDP growth forecast since 2011, and you can see the black line is slowing growth, and they keep getting their forecasts wrong. And even though at their most recent forecast it was a little bit more optimistic, we are living in a world of population aging and perhaps the thickening of borders. Slow growth makes it very difficult for any government to do the business it has to do. So why practice gender budgeting in this environment? First of all, economic optimization. Getting more women into the labor market and using their paid and unpaid labor more effectively can occur from better resource allocation, whether it's labor or capital, the access of women entrepreneurs to venture capital, or to what I call here technology, but it's often just basic access to basic utilities and services. There are also social efficiencies from doing gender budgeting, both in the allocation of paid and unpaid labor, but also you have lower risk from broader access to basics, health and education in particular, but also clean water, for example. It depends on, of course, the state of your underlying economy. Finally, I shouldn't say finally, but the third point is fiscal improvements. If you have more participation of half of your population, then you're going to find higher revenues, public revenues, as well as GDP growth, lower costs because people are more fully optimized, and less inequitable results, both in terms of how people are taxed and how spending occurs through the public system, which leads to greater political stability, something that we need a lot more of these days. And finally, greater political accountability, but both through ex ante target setting of gender budgets and through ex post reviews. You see the need for better data, and better data also always means greater political accountability of both the government and opposition to the government. Who practices gender budgeting? Well, I'm sorry if you heard this already, but we had a survey of the OECD in 2016 that identified 12 nations that actually put at their heart the idea of gender equality. You can add Canada to that list now. And an IMF survey showed that 23 nations were practicing some form of gender budgeting. And in this IMF survey, they were mostly non-OECD countries that were tested, and I've listed them here. Of course, these slides are available for you whenever you would wish to see them. I just want to go very briefly over the ex ante versus ex post way of doing gender budgeting. Ex ante means you establish a baseline of who gets what through public resources, and then you do a needs assessment. What is yet needed to be done? And then finally, you do a strategy. You do targets and timelines, and of course, you have to allocate to those targets and timelines resources. You have heard quite a bit about what kind of indicators you are trying to move the needle on. For example, violence against women, the rates of violence against women, access to utilities, sometimes as basic as water, fuel, or energy, and telecom. Health and education outcomes can be the things that you are targeting to change. You can target to change the proportion of a household budget that is spent on housing or childcare or education. You can target to change labor force participation rates or the size of the wage gap. You can target social security provisions such as access to and amounts of pensions and jobless benefits. And you can also look at tax expenditures. We often talk about revenues as well as spending. Tax expenditures, which are the ways in which governments permit people not to pay taxes, to incentivize particular business and household practices. That too can be very gender disparate. How do you do gender budgeting ex post? Basically, an ex post gender budgeting process is about setting performance targets and reviewing resource allocation and looking at how budget incidence is taking place, both in terms of spending and revenues. I will be looking at that in a further slide. Ex post, it would occur within finance, and it would also occur outside of finance. If you have a political taste in your nation for gender anything, you are going to find it both within government, in opposition to the government position, and in civil society. Sometimes this materializes in the form of a gender audit, specifically through the Office of the Auditor in your nation, to be able to assess outside of the government an arm's length assessment of how the government performance has been on these stated or absent promises. Separately, you can do a gendered analysis, either in the documents that follow a budget or actually built right into the budget document. And that would be reviewing outcomes from previous budgets and progress on previously established targets and timelines. The big question is, how do you prioritize your focus? Should you prioritize it on government expenses or on government revenues? This is what we refer to as cost benefit of federal spending. In every nation, women use more and provide more public services, but it is always easier to calculate the costs of a service, how much it cost on a budget line, than the benefits. And also, equivalently, the focus on taxes and tax expenditures is far more easily measured than anything we do on the spending side, because you can see who is paying and who gets the tax cuts. It's a winners and losers argument that is very easy to lay out. And even when it's not gender disaggregated, often most governments have got income-related data, and there is a very tight correlation between income and gender that is pretty easy to proxy. The incidence of benefits of services are not easy to measure for a variety of reasons. And the costs of service loss is the same issue. The issue is, do you just measure it in the time frame of the year in which a change takes place? For example, investments in healthcare or education have a long time flow of benefits. How do you establish how many years of benefits you got from 1 year of expenditure in some population health or public education measure, for example? And it is also difficult to measure the incidence of benefits distributionally, which is incredibly important, by age, by gender, by income, and I could add to that by newcomer statuses. That seems to be a new consideration. I'm going to show you two examples in Canada. One, this is it from 1994. This was how the federal government spent on housing. And was it redistributive? Yes, it was. The blue line shows a variety of changes. A variety of, my apologies. The graph on the left shows how expenditures were made by the federal level of government across 10 income deciles for a variety of programs, and you can see that housing by far was the most redistributive. In other words, more of an impact on low-income housing than anything else. And in fact, the greatest benefits from recreational and culture spendings went to the highest income households. This is a very an unpublished document from our own Department of Finance in 1994. And you can see, if you took a look at the way it was spent compared to other expenditures, same process. If you want to do this type of analysis, it's very difficult to do and it's hard to sustain year after year. This does not include the multi-year impact of these redistributive spendings. The next slide will show you the same thing, an effort that was made. This was not in finance. This was done in the organization in which I used to work, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. This was also a distributional analysis. Instead of deciles, it used income classes, and it showed that the poorest income class in Canada received more than 2.5 times the value of its income in the form of public services by imputing a dollar value at the minimum wage of the type of services they got. This is pretty typical, and this is one of the reasons why women always benefit more from public services than men, because women tend to be poorer and more reliant on everything from healthcare and education to public transit and libraries, and even things like clean water in developing countries. If you can provide clean water, you have automatically reallocated unpaid labor to more efficient uses of unpaid labor. The question that is often on politicians' minds is, we are putting more money in your pockets. Whose pockets? So for the last 20 years, one of the primary policy priorities of our governments in Canada have been, both at the federal and the subnational level, have been tax cuts. And if you take a look on the left side of this slide, you will see that more women than men will never benefit from income tax cuts because their taxable income is not high enough. Since 2008, the data on income, class plus gender is no longer published. So it's not just a question of getting more data, it's also suppressing data so that we don't have these conversations, which have been taking place in Canada since 2006. On the right-hand side, who do services reach? Again, a question of data. Often we do not know who most utilizes services. We know that women are more reliant on public services because of our long-form census and the questions that were asked. In 2010, the federal government of the day tried to abolish the long-form census. So we can get some information through administrative data, but that is far more intrusive than a long-form census. And only census in Canada provides an intersectionality of data with race and immigration status, which is highly important in a nation that has been welcoming quite a lot of newcomers and has thus far avoided the very politically fractious conversation about newcomers. So what do you need to do gender budgeting? First of all, you need to be able to track past program-specific spending, that is budget lines. For that, you need a form of public accounts and tax expenditures, because what we spend is also, as I said earlier, married by how much revenues we forego for the purposes of incentivizing behavior. So tax expenditures are very useful too. The second thing you need, so that's about the past. About the future, you need to be able to model the costs and the benefits of future proposals, whether they come from the government or whether they come from the opposition. For both of these exercises, you need data. And for both of these exercises, you need the interest and sustained interest of both the government and the opposition. The opposition is often driven by civil society's pressure. And finally, you need resources. If you don't have money, you don't have a strategy. This was a point that was made briefly in passing by Helmut. On the right-hand side, you will see the cover of a document that I wrote showing that how much Canada spent on its commitment to equality signed in Beijing in 1995. So it was a gender analysis of the last 10 federal budgets on the 10th anniversary of the Beijing Accord. And it's an extremely thick document. It is not easy to read, but you can do it file by file. But here's my last point here about resources. Does size matter? In Canada, we have had a deliberate policy in the last 20 years to shrink the size of government. This is not unique to Canada. This is the federal government's revenues and expenses as a share of GDP. You will see that the target for the next 5 years is to shrink the size of government to below the size it was in 1966, half a century ago. You cannot build a new world if you don't have enough resources. So a 1% difference in GDP today would mean about $24 billion a year to spend on things that could reduce gender inequalities. It's not inconsequential. And so size does matter. So here's my takeaways from the gender budgeting exercise. Within the context of slow and slowing growth, and increasingly fractious politics, distributional considerations in budgets matter more than ever. And I would add to that, in nations where there seems to be a throwback, a kind of nostalgia for an era that has come and gone, perhaps an era where men were men and women stayed at home, these considerations are more critical than ever politically. And whereas we may not get there right now, we understand that we are on a collision course with population aging and trade slowdown. And in this respect, gender budgeting can improve economic performance, political accountability, but you can't do it without more public spending. The irony is more public spending can grow your economy because if it's inclusive of half the population's well-being in terms of both opportunities and outcomes. And finally, budget measures that do tackle gender inequality could become extremely politically popular, particularly with the next generation. But that may not happen quickly because we are facing a massive backlash around the world. Thank you very much for your time.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Armin, for the presentation. So we do not have much time, but I would like to ask everyone who's online. You have a chat box on the top right corner of your screen. So if you can type in your questions there, either send them to me or just send them to everyone. We'll ask our presenters to address some of those. Given the time constraints, we will do most of the follow-up after this webinar during this coming week. So please take your time to just write your questions for Armin, Helmut, or Christina. And meanwhile, Mitch will have a short comment.
To start with, I just wanted to thank our three presenters. I think that in three really succinct presentations, you really were able to capture everything, the big debate that we've been having within the community. We touched upon the economics behind the need for gender budgeting specifically, but it also extends to understanding the budgetary impacts on diverse groups within communities, and then started to drill down and look at some of the tools that can be used. I was very interested to hear how the gender budgeting tools used in the Austrian example were linked to the broader budgetary reforms. But nonetheless, I think that there are a lot of lessons that can be gleaned from the Austrian experience that relate to those systems that might not have implemented kind of outcome budgeting yet. But nonetheless, I think that seeing how those reforms came about in the last couple of years in Austria was very informative. And the debate around gender and how we would include that both from the economic perspective, but also from the broader budgeting perspective. The Canadian experience, I think, is really quite telling. I know that this is a topic that has been of great interest to the community. You have wanted to be able to continue to be able to have this debate. And so I'm very grateful for the three presenters who've been able to come along today and join us, because I think it is enabled us to be able to respond to some very specific requests that have come through from the members of the community. So thank you.
All right. This is a bit more typing.
Well, whilst we're waiting then, we've got a couple of questions coming through via IM. I don't like to hog the time. I've got a question though, so I might jump in. I would be interested to get the reflection from all our presenters on ways in which you think, if you had any tricks up your sleeve, for those community members who might be doing analysis in jurisdictions where you might, for instance, you might not have disaggregated data, or you might not be able to access kind of all the informational points that you have been using in your own analysis in your jurisdictions. Are there kind of proxies that can be used, or are there kind of global sources of data that you have drawn upon in your own analysis that you think might be useful for the community members? Great.
I can go, Mitch, if you like. It's Armin. I think it does depend on the nature of data that a nation has, whether they do have administrative data or whether they're starting from scratch. One of the conversations I had about how to allocate, very scarce resources for maximum impact was with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And their precursor for being able to allocate any money was data. They needed a data baseline. And they said that they would not invest anywhere if they didn't have data. And if it required an investment in collecting the data, that's what they would do first before they progressed. So without some kind of a baseline assessment of where you're at, you cannot move the needle on anything. If you don't have basic data, then you need to collect it. If you do have basic data through administrative systems, whether they're education or health, police records, whatever they are, that's where you start. And I think the big story of data is that the process of gender budgeting makes us more, we're looking for evidence better. So it makes us better evidence-based decision makers to just have a gender budgeting process built into the system.
Great. And another question that we have is, before Christina or Helmut respond, is what is the specific role of the Austrian PBO in the gender impact analysis? And then there is another one. But Helmut and Christina, would you like to respond to that?
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you now.
We can hear you. Oh, we did hear you.
That all the or much of the information in the budget was in different places. So it was one of our first work to make a landscape of all the gender goals and all the gender indicators, so that the parliamentarians could easily access the budget information and could easily access the main facts, so that they can concentrate in their speeches and in their political work especially on these effects. And we also see that the analysis of the PBO was one of the first analysis we had in this field of considering how to look at the budget. And so it was quite interesting that many of the also civil society associations tried to get into contact with the Parliamentary Budget Office and asked us for speeches also outside of the Parliament, and to give our impression on this budget gender budgeting exercise according to the new budget law. And with respect of data, I would say what's very important is that you concentrate your efforts on specific topics where either data is available or where it's quite easy to collect data, and there should be some pressure on the ministries that are responsible for the policy design that they should provide the necessary data. And as we see in the past, if they are responsible for designing gender budget strategies, then they will also have some possibilities to get data, for example, from the National Statistics Office, because according to our law of the National Statistics Office, gender statistics was not part of their task. But we saw that many of the ministries then made specific projects to get data for this topic that is really interesting for their policy making. That may, for example, be data on subsidies for sport events that can also be analyzed from a data disaggregated perspective, but also data from the tax collection or whatever. And ministries often have the possibility from the database to extract some gender disaggregated data.
Great, thank you, Helmut. We have a question for both of you, and this is from question from Tamoya Christie, who works in the gender cross-cutting solutions area here at the bank. And the question is the following: how comparable are the gender budgeting tools used in Canada versus Austria? And how should a country decide on its specific approach to gender budgeting? For example, a developing country. So Armin, if you could take that, and then we can hear from our Austrian PBO colleagues.
That's a very difficult question to answer, Tamoya, because Canada is still in the process of developing its gender budgeting tools, and we are learning from Austria. I think we're all learning from one another in real time. And I think the type of thing that you are doing this morning is to bring awareness that we are all in the process of both listening and learning and experimenting. And what needs to happen is two things need to happen. The first is to show best practices, as you have done this morning. And part of, it's true that when the OECD surveyed nations, Canada did not appear as a country that gender budgeted, but we have had gender budgeting laws in place for years. We just didn't practice them. We didn't enforce them. So that's the secondary part of your question is, how well can you enforce them, and how much do you need civic society to demand this change, that it is a political pressure point that makes these things happen and happen to the best of their abilities. And there, the technocratic part of it cannot trump the desire to have a more equal society.
Great, thank you, Armin. Christina, Helmut, would you mind responding to the same question as well?
Too much insight in the system of Canada, but it's always interesting to get the view of other countries because, we can only learn from each other. And I think also the developing countries can, even if they have quite different problems in respect of gender equality or gender budgeting, they can at least learn how we use our tools. They can learn that gender disaggregated data are necessary. They can learn that the system alone does not promote results without tracing the instruments, without a permanent effort to follow up on all the issues, because also what we see, the system alone doesn't improve the data. You have to have political pressure on it. You have to provide the data for the civil society. You have to provide the data for the politicians so that they can really put some pressure on the decision makers to improve the situation.
I wonder if I could jump in, please.
Yes, go on.
I would like to back up what Helmut was saying and maybe take it a step further. One of my slides showed who is it that's doing gender budgeting. And this was a presentation that I was privileged enough to witness on April 4th at the Rotman School of Management, which is business school at the University of Toronto campus. And we had somebody talk to us from the IMF about the 23 incidences of prevalent gender budgeting exercises, both within and outside of the OECD. And the one that got the most attention was Rwanda, and how much Rwanda has been able to change its society from clearly not a similar place, but the degree to which gender budgeting has lifted so many people's experiences up. And so to say that, developing nations can only learn from us is far from the truth. We can certainly learn from a number of the developing nations. And I think the IMF incubator idea is definitely worth looking at for ideas on how you can do this. And also not-for-profits, that charitable organizations, and it's certainly not limited to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but there are mechanisms we must all take into account, because public resources are scarce everywhere. There's never enough money to do anything. So to use public resources in a way that maximizes impact for the entire society is perhaps more important than ever. And gender budgeting helps you do that.
Great, thank you, Armin. So we're actually getting a lot of questions. Arsenio is asking 3. I'm going to read them really quickly, and then you can decide which one to answer. So he's asking, there are a set of tools to introduce gender budgeting approach in the budget, but in my view, the main constraints are still on the data or the disaggregated data produced by the government. Is there any tool that could help on that, or how can governments be a bit more proactive on aggregate data? Also, how can Parliament contribute to improve in introducing gender budgeting in their country? And then he's asking, the parliaments have an important role in financial oversight. How can they help to achieve this? And lastly, I think he's referring to Armin when you said that if there are no resources, there is no strategy. So could you elaborate more on that, looking for the context in developing countries? So Armin, would you take a quick
I'm just wondering if you could rephrase that third question about there are no resources, there is no strategy.
And then he's asking, what does it mean for the context of a developing country?
You can do gender budgeting in any context. I mean, if a not-for-profit can figure out how to do gender budgeting or have a gender impact. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I'm going to use this again, but you could apply it to any number of foundations that have as their main goal maternal and childhood health. This is sine qua non gender budgeting. Any not-for-profit that wants to bring in clean water knows the impact is differential. You don't need a lot of data to see how do women spend most of their time in many very poor jurisdictions as they're walking for many kilometers a day fetching potable water. So you get clean water, you're going to change the utilization of their unpaid time, which is good for the men in their communities because suddenly you can do more with the existing resources. So the idea that you need data, it's always better to have data. Doesn't mean you can't do something. I mean, you can actually talk to communities to see what needs most fixing. I would guarantee you in 85% of the instances, you would be looking at something that has a gendered impact. And your question about, Arsenio, your question about the main constraint being data, I think that is true in many jurisdictions, but you know, public health has been gathering data since the 1880s around the world. Sometimes gathering data is just a question of taking a pad and a pencil and going to the jurisdiction you want. So gathering data is not an unbroachable task, but it does require either political will on the part of the government or on the part of civil society or the opposition to mount the case. This is an evidentiary case. This needs doing. Let me show you why it needs doing and what would happen if you did it. It has to be an exercise of passion.
Thank you. So we're just going to go quickly on this. There is a question on both parliaments regarding specific hearings at the Budget Committee on budget and gender impact analysis. So maybe Helmut or Christina can take on that.
The question is on whether there are specific hearings on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
On gender issues.
Whether specific hearings on gender budgeting and impact analysis.
So what we do in the Austrian Parliament is on the one hand side, we discuss every single chapter of the budget in the Budget Committee. And so the outcome information, the performance information was a very central part during the last committee debates on the budget. And increasingly also the gender aspects, so the gender objective and the measures to achieve the gender objectives were also debated in the committee debates. But there is a debate on where the gender aspects could be discussed within the parliamentary budget debate, but there is no specific hearing or no specific occasion for the gender aspects. And regarding the ex-ante reports, there is a report that has to be tabled on the ex-ante assessments by the Federal Performance Management Office. And that report, again, is then discussed in the Budget Committee. So again, we have the Budget Committee would be the place to discuss the gender aspects.
Great.
We in Canada also do have specific hearings on gender budgeting. We have a Status of Women Committee, and it has its own parliamentary committee. These discussions take place every year before the budget and after the budget. Again, it's driven by politics. When this committee is governed and chaired by a government that is not that interested in it, the conversation doesn't go very far. This particular government considers itself a feminist budget. Those conversations have been really ramped up. Those conversations will also take place at Cabinet Office and in the Treasury Board, which is the part of the government that governs the purse strings. We are hoping to have it mainstreamed in a lot of different areas of budgetary conversation. But the place that would enforce it is the Ministry of the Status of Women, and its budget is very tiny, and it does not have the capacity internally or interministerially to accomplish anything. So there's no cohesion, like even though you have specific hearings, there's no cohesion and enforcement and kind of shepherding the process. There's no part of the government that's tasked with shepherding that process. It should normally be the Status of Women Minister, but their budget is way too small to have anything happen, and that's a concern.
Great. So in the interest of time, I will ask the two more questions, and then if you can just take just answer them one after the other. The first one is, do you check the accuracy or reliability of the impact analysis sent to the Parliament by the government? And second, does the PBO in your countries have a gender and equity budget responsive analytical framework in place? And if so, can we share the same?
Okay, so for the first question about the accuracy and the reliability of impact assessments, so as we are only 8 people in the PBO in Austria, what we usually do is we focus on some of the government bills, and we do check the reliability and the accuracy, especially of the assessments of the impacts on the public budgets. So we mainly focus on, or our scrutiny is focused on those bills that are tabled to the Budget Committee and the Finance Committee, and some major structural reforms in the other committees. So just in terms of staff constraints, it's not possible to check all the impact assessments that are sent to Parliament. We have to focus our scrutiny. And what we usually do is we, of course, also look at the assessments and at the results of the assessments of the other impact dimensions. So if some of the results that are part of the legislative materials are not plausible to us, then we would raise questions on those issues. But we are still constrained to the legal framework that is the basis for the assessment of the gender aspects. So we don't have an additional framework for assessing the gender aspects. We look at what is tabled by the ministries. Yeah.
Yeah, but I want to add, what we normally do is we look at international data, because often in our budget documents we found the data is provided by the different ministries, but we try to at least cross-check them with some international data, or we are providing additional data that give an external view on the situation in Austria. For example, the OECD data or data of the IMF, because the OECD, for example, made a big analysis on the gender dimension in Austria. And so we try to at least give an additional input to the parliamentary debate from the international organizations.
From the Canadian point of view, our PBO is perhaps smaller than yours, Christina and Helmut. Because we are muddling our way through the accuracy or reliability, we rely very heavily on not just the PBO, which has not actually, it has struggled to do any kind of distributional analysis. We got a couple of reports a little while ago, about a year and a bit ago, and nothing since. It's almost like everybody, they're very weak on the distributional side, and it is a very challenging part of the task of PBOs to do, because it really does upset the status quo. And it's, as I pointed out in my presentation, you can do it both from a cost side and a benefit side. And we always do the cost side and we rarely look at the benefit side, which means that we get less discussion about the benefit side of public spending. So I think the idea of producing targets and timelines, things that you do want to affect through gender budgeting, is the critical role, and perhaps the PBO can help, in Canada, can help move that conversation along, but we rely very heavily right now on both government statements and civic society's assessment of that, which would tend to come from the academic and civil society communities.
Yeah, that's.
And I agree with Helmut. I would agree with Helmut that increasingly the degree of focus that the OECD and the IMF have put on these topics have made our task easier.
Yeah, and we have a few comments and questions, but just related to that, another comment from Tamoya. She said that that she agrees with the need for pressure, especially in high levels, as the IMF study showed, and having the high buy-in and primary involvement of the Ministry of Finance was crucial, as opposed to just being the purview of the women's ministry. So, and also on the point on civil society, that was also very instrumental in keeping the focus on the issue. So, unfortunately, we have run out of time, and there is more questions. But the good news is that, as it's our practice with these webinars, we do some follow-up work with it as well. So basically, what we'll do during this week is that we will send an email to not just the participants of this conversation, but to our entire GNPBO community, because a lot of people cannot attend, the live webinar because of time zones. So we'll send an email with a few things. We'll send the presentations by Armin, Helmut, and Christina. We will send the recording of this of the webinar as well. And thirdly, we will compose a short survey with 5 to 7 questions. Questions basically similar to what we got during the live webinar, and we'll send this question to our community so we can get some primary data on gender budgeting practice in our PBO landscape, so we can understand it better. So wait for that email during this week, and we will ask our presenters to probably maybe share their emails if they are comfortable with it, and participants can ask those questions directly, and we'll do some more follow-up and commenting after that in the ePBO page, in the ePBO platform. We'll post everything there, so you can write comments and questions on the comments thread as well. So with that, I would like to thank our presenters, Armin, Christina, and Helmut. Thank you so much for your time and availability. I think this is a very rich discussion, and there is definitely a conversation to be had, and we saw a lot of lessons and experiences that can be shared. And we think that with this particular topic will be of interest as well during our annual assembly of the Global Network of Parliamentary Budget Offices happening in June in Ottawa. So thank you all very much, and especially thank you to Armin, Christina, and Helmut, and we will absolutely continue the conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.